you. Okay, thanks very much for that introduction, Edward, and I'm delighted to be here, and congratulations on the founding of the CAF. I'm actually a bit nervous because I can't remember exactly what it stands for. Committee for Academic Freedom. Okay, so by now it seems clear to me, at least, that there is a free speech crisis in universities, and for that matter, across society as a whole. However, as is frequently observed, it's not quite like previous free speech crises, for instance, those that come up in authoritarian contexts involving direct government interference, for instance. And so the newness of the phenomenon, I think, allows people, particularly those unaffected by it, to deny that it is happening at all. And that's one of the major impediments to any progress. So in a nutshell, I think the nature of the crisis is that academics are being incentivized indirectly by a number of converging factors to think and talk very much like everyone around them, and to fear the consequences of doing otherwise. Sometimes they're being incentivized by indirect carrots, and sometimes they're being threatened by indirect sticks. But the result is conformism, agreement or just silence on what stance to take in difficult polarized issues. And the few people that diverge from the common opinion end up very isolated and sometimes scapegoated. And that is obviously the opposite of what any of us want when we want a vigorous, argumentative, relatively obstreperous culture in universities for all sorts of reasons. Before I elaborate a bit on that, I want to dismiss a different way of thinking about the problem, which I think is unhelpful. And that would be to see it mainly through a political lens. So the unhelpful story goes, it's quite a popular story, the left dominate universities, which of course they do. A left-wing political outlook in particular makes you susceptible to groupthink, safetyism, magical thinking, makes you uninterested in freedom of thought, you think it's dangerous. Meanwhile, those on the right are much more likely to be interested in free speech because they are interested in freedom generally, and they are constitutionally averse to safetyism because they are stiff, upper-lipped, resilient types. And I'm sure many of you are. But, excuse me. So if you are on the right, that's a very comforting story. You can tell yourself that if you were in charge of universities, there'd be no problem at all with academic freedom. And at times, this story can become positively conspiratorial. So there are some who believe that the left did this on purpose. They took a lesson from Gramsci. Back in the 60s, they started the long march through the institutions to dismantle liberal values from the inside and assert their own counter-hegemony, and so on. And that this is still going on now. And there's a whole raft of US-based, mainly US-based culture warriors, very keen on that story, are making money out of that story, talking about cultural Marxism in our institutions and so on. But in the case of the UK anyway, and I say this with great affection, I think the story probably gives too much credit to people working in universities. And I'd like to think academics had the organizational skills to carry out such an elaborate, far-sighted scheme, but I don't think they're up to it. So, and there's also the fact, well, this is the main fact, that the problem is not necessarily left-wing sensibilities in the sector, although in some cases they don't help, but it's more the fact that the university sector is one-dimensional politically, and that's the problem. So I do assume that many of these problems would emerge if the sector mostly voted right rather than voting left, because the problem is ideological homogeneity and not the political flavor of it. If you are surrounded by others who share your values and your intuitions, and it will seem, of course, that you have freedom to say something different because it's a hypothetical, it's a counterfactual that will never be put to the test. Now, it's true that at the moment that the academic freedom problem in universities is compounded by people, mainly on the left, denying that it exists. And I will talk about some of the strategies of denial in a moment. But I do assume that if the situation reversed, the right would be subject to almost exactly the same cognitive deficits that are contributing to the failure to see the problem, confirmation bias being an obvious one, motivated reasoning, dismissing confounding evidence, and so on. And those are human deficits. They're not confined to one area of the political spectrum. If you don't meet any obstacles to the things you say, because as it happens, everyone around you is patting you on the back and saying, that's right, you're very unlikely to feel that your speech and your thought are constrained in a way that might move you to action. And there's also the basic fact that it is much harder, psychologically speaking, to stand up against the suppression of ideas you think are false than it is to fight the suppression of ideas you think are true. And that's a human tendency. So that explains a lot of silence. People just don't care enough about the issues to say anything. And I think that gives rise to a subsidiary effect, which is that if you do come across people fighting for the right to express some particular idea, you pretty much assume that they believe it. I mean, almost always. It used to quite annoy me when I was under the cosh at Sussex, because people would say, of course she should have the right to say what she thinks. And I think, oh, why don't you just say you agree with me? You clearly do. So the upshot is I don't think the right should be too smug about the problems in universities at the moment, and they certainly shouldn't take refuge in the consoling fantasy of a deliberate conspiracy here, I don't think. I think a better story is cock-up rather than conspiracy. I think multiple mechanisms of modern life, and especially within the university sector, are blindly acting to make people conformist and fearful of offence to the detriment of academic inquiry. And in most cases, the effect is unintended. It's a byproduct of other things that were intended. It's just that now nobody knows how to unpick the effects. And in some cases, the antecedents of the crisis are relatively apolitical, and in others, the responsibility is shared between right and left. So, for instance, in no particular order, and I will just touch on these briefly because I think they'll be familiar to anyone who's thought about this, the internet has clearly changed everything. Speech is now public like it never was public before. Everything you say on the internet potentially is public speech. It can be clipped, it can be recorded, even without you knowing. Someone could be recording this, cutting it up and putting it out on the internet to create a story about what I said that I would have no real ability to overcome in some areas. Narcissistic individuals within institutions can capitalize on the nature of social media to win support or wreak revenge on their enemies. Everyone's frightened and nobody knows how to deal with that. So that's a big problem. Another, in the university sector, another massive factor is the introduction of student fees. First by Labour, then by the Tories and the Lib Dems. So that just changed everything. We immediately got customers who, the main thing that we had to become concerned with was their satisfaction and their experience. And it's not about their needs, it's about their wants. And then we got the National Student Survey brought in to give them a big exit survey, saying whether they felt that their wants were satisfied and whether they had the right sort of experience. And I think that factor alone plays such a big causal role in so many of the thought-suppressing mechanisms further down, because it's a naked fear of losing customers through alienating them. And there's also, that's exacerbated by the ferocious competition between universities for students now that the caps come off, so that some institutions are desperate for students. They'll do anything. And that includes branding themselves in ways that they think will attract students, the kite mark schemes, the Stonewall branding, everything that they can make them seem remotely cool or welcoming or comforting or parental. All these brand values that the universities now have, like kindness and inclusion. They're trying to they're trying to get your money, or their money. And there's also the problem of student mental health looming here. The government has put enormous pressure on the university sector to take care of student mental health, to prevent student suicide. That's not a problem the university sector can solve. They don't have the resources. It's much, much bigger than the university sector. It's probably connected to smartphones much earlier on. At least that's a contributory factor. And so the result in the classroom is mostly superficial gestures in favour of protecting people with trigger warnings and taking things off the reading list if someone objects, and just that kind of safetyism. Okay. There's also a couple of other general problems facing not just the university sector. There's unintended consequences of the Equality Act, or bits of the Equality Act, so the perceived need for constantly updating your equality training If you don't update it, then you might be liable in court should anything go wrong. So you've constantly got to ship in external organizations to refresh your training, and they don't give a toss about academic freedom, but they do think that there are certain kinds of speech that are profoundly harmful, and they will say so. And then this will ripple down through HR and through managers into the policies. And there's just also mimetic effects, like what gets presented as best practice here will then just start going out like blindly through the institutions because they will read about it in HR magazine, you know. So, I mean, mimetic effects are also present in academic departments, obviously, who, you know, grabbing the latest cool-sounding theory which says that truth doesn't really exist or whatever. So there's just all this stuff going on. And as I say, I don't think there's any kind of deliberate desire here to control things. I think the managers have not cared or paid attention to the effects downstream. So in this context, it's been very gratifying to see organizations like CAF emerge. One of the worst things about being a scapegoated academic when you are in a university is the sense of isolation, because nobody wants to talk to you, because they're literally frightened to be seen with you. So the presence of local branches of CAF and of CAF putting academics together with each other is crucial to build support for intellectual outliers. And it also seems like you're making great headway in uncovering, publicizing these unintended effects of the sort of factors I've mentioned in terms of policies. I expect there will be material there for years to come because nobody has been paying attention. I see that you've had a piece this week about it being considered a microaggression in some universities to say that you're looking for the person best qualified for the job. But I mean, it is. Those sorts of things are all over the place because nobody looked and nobody paid any attention until now. So it's sort of low-hanging fruit. You can generate a newspaper story every week, I should think, for the next 5 years. So that's all good, but I think there's also something else that academics have to do. You would normally expect academics to be the most able critics of what is happening in universities. They have all the skills. You know, obviously sociologists, anthropologists, historians and philosophers and psychologists could tell us what is happening here, but the trouble is they daren't look at themselves because the topic is universities and the subjects are to some extent themselves. And I also think there's a desire not to undermine the university sector in public any more than it's already is. It's already very beleaguered. So it is great to see academics taking on this role, but it's, as good as these formal organizations are, we also need bravery from academics at individual level in their everyday life to recover their critical faculties, or if maybe they haven't lost them, but you know, to express them a bit more, and start confronting these terrible ideas which are being blindly parroted across the sector. So we need to root out the bad ideas, and there are so many bad ideas, particularly in the humanities, where methodologies are much more disparate and contested than in science and in the social sciences. I think yet another indirect effect of turning students into customers is that managers have come to place a big emphasis on smooth professionalism, uniformity of teaching experience. Everyone should have a PowerPoint. Everyone should have access to all sorts of electronic resources. And that means that new hires are usually the sort of person who can handle a PowerPoint and manage an electronic register and write grant applications in bureaucratic language. And I think this has a downside, which means we're losing this sort of intellectually aggressive, rude, eccentric, iconoclastic, witty people that most of us were taught by, I think. I definitely was. Probably bruising experience to meet them, very memorable, and they possibly changed your life or possibly humiliated you very badly. But either way, it was a useful presence, these people in universities, because they wouldn't be frightened to say this is ridiculous. They could be incredibly scathing. And when I think back to philosophy in the 90s, Edward's a philosopher, so am I, it was verging on savage. I mean, grown men would weep, literally, in research seminars in St Andrews in 1993. You know, they used to call it a home win if they'd made the speaker cry. You know, so there was sort of magnificent contempt for stupid ideas, sloppy thinking, fallacious reasoning, begging the question. You know, all the usual. Dramatic intellectual exchanges, and all of those things I don't see anymore. Everything's very polite, and you've got your questions say things like, "That's really interesting. Could you say a bit more about that?" And we need to try and recover that. My point being, we can create a theoretical space for academic freedom. We have legislation. We can tell students it's really important you have some, but unless we fill the vacuum with actual, you know, intellectual, vibrant arguments, what's it for? So we have to actually go for the ideas and not just keep going, of course they should have the freedom of speech to criticize them. We need to criticize them. And philosophy has a role to play there, actually, particularly for any philosophers in the room, because so many of the bad ideas are in the name of philosophy in other disciplines. So anyway, I would like a drink. I'm sure you'd like another drink, so I'm going to stop there. Finish by congratulating Edward again and all the other members of the organisation. I think he looks absolutely brilliant, and I'm very pleased to see it. I've just remembered questions.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. That was great.